Hi, I am Ms. Roz. Today we are going to start talking about the yeast unit. So I'm going to talk about some of the basics of yeast and also talk about two of the types of mixing methods. Right. So first off, fermentation. Right. This is when the yeast and the enzymes start to work together and they break down the carbohydrates within all the ingredients, and this is what we call fermentation. And they actually produce two byproducts. Right. So fermentation is the breakdown of the carbohydrates, right? And we're using the yeast to do this, and the enzymes that are found within the yeast, right? And they produce two byproducts. One is alcohol, okay, and this is going to be for flavor, right? However, the second one is going to be carbon dioxide, right? And if you remember from science class, CO2 is a gas, right? And this is going to be for the leavening agent. Okay? So you'll notice that bread tends to have a particular flavor to it, and that's because of the alcohol. Right? You will not get drunk off of your bread because you will be baking it. But then also the carbon dioxide is what helps to rise your bread, right? When we make yeast bread, it takes much longer than what we're used to when we did with the quick mix methods, right? With the quick mix, I was able to mix my ingredients, make a batter, and put it directly in the oven, and it would be done within a half hour, 45 minutes. However, with yeast bread, this is a little different because we need to let this carbon dioxide create more gas, right? And so that means that it's going to actually take closer to an hour to 3 hours to let your product rise before you can shape it and then put it in the oven to bake, right? So just keep that in mind that yeast breads do take a little bit longer, right? When we do make yeast breads, there are some key ingredients that we use to help with the production of our yeast breads. Right? One of the first ones is sugar. Right? So this could be in the form of granulated sugar, brown sugar, honey, maple syrup, agave, whatever it is. But this sugar that we use is helps to feed our yeast. Right? So in order for my yeast to grow and to create that carbon dioxide, I need it to feed it. And so the sugar is what the yeast feeds off of. However, we also have salt, and this is what is going to help control that yeast, right? So as that yeast is growing, feeding off the sugar, right? That salt that you add into into the ingredients is going to help make sure that the yeast doesn't grow out of control, right? And then you have flour and water, and what remember from when we did quick breads and cookies and all those kinds of things is that flour plus water or any kind of liquid makes gluten. Okay, and so in yeast products, right, we want to develop a lot of gluten. All right, and then what happens is that the gluten tends to help trap that carbon dioxide gas, which helps then leaven your ingredients. Okay, or leaven your bread, I should say. Right, so that's kind of the basics of yeast bread for right now. Right, we're going to talk about two types of mixing methods. Right, we have what we call the conventional method, and then we have the quick mix method. You can make any yeast breads using either method, but there are some kind of advantages to one versus the other. Right, so in my conventional method, right, we are going to first dissolve the yeast that we have into water. Right? And typically this water should be at a temperature of about 105 to 110 degrees. Right? And this is what we call proofing. Right? You are proofing the yeast. Right? The advantage to doing the conventional method is to find out and make sure that your yeast is working. Right? So in this conventional proofing method, I put that yeast into the water and let it grow, and so I know that that yeast is actually working, right? So if you have older yeast and you're not sure if it's still good, this is a good way to go, right? But after that, right, I'm going to heat any other kinds of liquids I have, right? So maybe it might be egg, butter, milk, whatever, and then I'm going to add it in with my dissolved yeast, my proofed yeast, right? And then I'm going to, like I just said, mix it with the yeast, right? And once that's all together, and then I'm going to, the last thing I need to do is add the flour, right? And this is going to be based on the recipe, right? So depending on what your recipe says, it may say to, you might have a soft dough or what we call a stiff dough, meaning it's very hard to work with, or soft dough, which is very, what we call pliable, very flexible, right? So this is the conventional method, right? Which is really the proofing, okay? However, we also have the quick mix method, right? So what you would first do is you would mix all your dry ingredients together. Right, so my dry ingredients may be sugar, flour, salt, yeast. Any of those ingredients would all go into one bowl, right? And then I'm going to heat, right, my liquid ingredients, right? And this time with my heating, I can actually heat it somewhere between 100 and I say somewhere between 115 and 125 degrees, right? You'll notice that in the quick mix method, it is higher than in the conventional method, right? I'm gonna come back to that, and I'll have you kind of think about why do you think in the quick mix method my temperature is higher than if it were in the conventional method, right? So as I'm going over this, you can continue to think about it, and we'll talk a little more about specifically why, right? And then I'm going to add my flour and mix, okay? And then the last thing is just going to be add additional flour if needed, right? Again, based on the recipe. If needed, based on the recipe. Okay. So like I said, when we were doing this, right, in my conventional method, I proof my yeast first. However, in my quick mix method, I don't actually proof my yeast. We will find this out if it works when we let the dough rise, right? So one of the reasons that your ingredient or your liquid is on a lower temperature is because I'm allowing that yeast to be in the water directly, right? There's nothing surrounding that yeast to help protect it, so the temperature needs to be slightly lower. However, if I'm doing the quick mix method, right, because it's mixed in with the flour, the sugar, the salt, and other things, that temperature of 115 to 125 can be slightly higher since your yeast is a little more protected, right? So I'm going to start the demonstration on the recipes, and then we'll come back a little later and talk a little more about kneading. Hi, I'm Ms. Roz. Today we are going to be making English muffins. I will talk about all the different ingredients, but I do want to let my yeast proof. So I'm going to actually add my sugar, which I believe is 2 tablespoons of sugar, all right, into my bowl here. I am going to use a stand mixer this time. I haven't used it so far in class, but I am going to use it because it helps make this a little quicker. I am then going to add 1 3/4 cup of some sugar, of some milk, right, to mix that sugar in, right, and then I'm actually going to add my yeast directly in. Now that milk should be lukewarm, right, so somewhere between 105 and 110 degrees, and so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to actually let it sit in here, and we're going to let it start working in what we call proofing it. So I'm going to let it sit to the side while I talk about the rest of my ingredients, right? So like I just said, we had 1 3/4 cup of lukewarm milk, so I put it in the microwave for about a minute and a half. It came directly from the refrigerator. When I hold the glass Pyrex, it should be kind of, a little warm to the touch. It shouldn't be super hot. So it's kind of another way to kind of feel it. If you have a thermometer, absolutely take temperature of the milk if you want, but just making sure that it's not too hot so that it won't kill your yeast, right? One of the things about your yeast is that if it's not warm enough, right, your yeast will not activate, right? So if it's too cold, it won't activate. However, if it's too hot, you'll kill your yeast, and then your yeast will not, it will die, and so then it also won't activate. So those are two kind of temperatures very important when making yeast breads, right? And then, like I said, I added 2 tablespoons of some sugar, and then 2 teaspoons of some yeast, right? You may have bought the little packets of yeast, and actually I don't own any of those little packets because I buy yeast in a bulk amount, but one of those little packets is about, give or take, a little more than 2 teaspoons, so I just put in 2 teaspoons of yeast in there. All right, so while I'm letting that proof, I want to proof it for about 5 minutes. I also want to just talk about, I have 1 egg, okay, and then I have about 1 1/4 teaspoons of salt. And then I also have 3 tablespoons brought to room temperature, so it's nice and soft. And then about 4.5 cups of some flour. Now, this is just regular all-purpose flour, right? Depending on the types of breads you make, you may want to try using other breads, other flour such as bread flour. One of the crucial things about making yeast bread is the amount of protein and gluten that you create. So gluten is a protein created from the flour and the liquid that you mix it with, right? And so the higher the gluten, or the higher the protein content in your flour, the more gluten it is going to develop, right? So when we talked about quick breads, we wanted to talk about how we didn't want to overdevelop that gluten. However, here in yeast breads, we do want to kind of really develop that gluten. So we're really going to mix it. We're going to knead it a lot so that we develop that gluten, because what will happen is you're going to create pockets of air, okay? All right, so let's wait for this yeast to finally proof so I can show you what it looks like, and then we'll get into mixing everything. Okay, so we're back from letting my yeast proof. So this is the conventional method, as we talked about in the lecture earlier. But you can see here in my conventional method, you can see the yeast is growing. Okay, so you can see that the brown here is growing. This is one of the pictures I definitely want you to take, because I want to know that your yeast was proofed correctly in your liquid. Okay, so since I'm using a stand mixer, I'm actually going to talk a little about the different types of attachments that you can use. Right, my stand mixer is, I think it's called Sunbeam. You may have a KitchenAid, you might have a Cuisinart, you might have some other kind of brand, but generally speaking, you're going to have at least 1, if not typically 3 types of beaters. All right, so you would have kind of ones, oops, I apologize for the loud clanking noise, regular kind of standard beaters, and that's what this is. If you have the KitchenAid, which I know is a very popular one, it would be kind of a flat paddle, right? This is what I would use with quick breads. So if I'm making brownies, cookies, cakes, things like that, this is the one that I would use, or that flat paddle, right? But I also have whisking ones, right? So they're much thinner, right? In the KitchenAid one, it kind of comes into like a triangle look, and it looks like a giant whisk, right? This is what we would use if we want to incorporate a lot of air. So if I wanted to whisk cream to make whipped cream, or if I wanted to whisk egg whites to make big clouds of egg whites, I would use my whisk attachment, right? But then we also have the dough hook, right? So on the I have 2. In the KitchenAid, you're going to have just 1, and it's going to be a lot bigger, right? But this is what we use to make yeast breads, right? And this is what I'm going to use for today, right? If you have a mixer, I do suggest using the mixer, because this will go a lot easier. However, you can make this without a mixer, but I do want to kind of show how to use the mixer, since I haven't done it with the quick bread. So we will be using the mixer in some of these new demonstrations. Okay, All right, so what I want to do is, number one, if your mixer has 2 attachments for your beaters, make sure you match up the correct ones, all right? You can see right here that there's a little red dot on mine. That means the one with the red matches into that one, and the other one goes into the right one. So the red one goes into the left, and then the white one goes into the right. All right. So like I said, this you can see here that my yeast is nice and proofed. And so one thing you want to make sure is that this bowl is nice and locked in. So you want to kind of make sure that you turn your bowl and you kind of hear it lock it into place and it doesn't move. All right. Now, it tells me that, right, I want to add in my butter and my egg. Okay. So I'm going to crack open my egg. All right. And add that to the rest of my liquid ingredients. And then I'm going to add my butter into those ingredients. Right, I'm actually going to add my salt so it gets distributed into the dry ingredients equally. Right, and then I'm going to turn this on. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm noticing that the dough hook is not working as well. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to change it out because it's just my liquid ingredients and I have not added my flour in yet. So I'm actually going to take these out and I'm going to use my regular beaters first. Okay, just to get this mixed in a little more. Okay. All right. Now, one of the things I always say is that you want to make sure that you don't, I do not want you to use your rubber scraper in here while it's moving, right? So please be sure to make sure that you turn off your mixer before you use it, okay? What I actually am going to do is, just to get this started, I'm going to add a little flour at a time before I switch over to the dough hook, because this is going to be, when I first start adding flour, is going to be more of a batter, right? And so I want my dough to be nice and soft. Okay, now while it's still a batter, okay, it's still really wet, right? I can keep the regular beaters on. However, right, once it starts to come together like a dough, I'm going to want to change it over to a dough hook. Okay, so I'm going to just add a little more flour, maybe another like scoop or so, to mix it to make sure it stays nice and smooth. Alright, so now that it's starting to come together, I'm actually going to change over my hook. Oops, sorry. Change this out. Okay, it should still kind of look like a pancake batter. It should not. You should not let it get too thick because then it gets stuck in your beaters, right? And that's kind of why you use the dough hook, because it won't get stuck in your dough hooks. All right, so let's switch these out. All right, red to red, white to white. All right, make sure they're in there nice. All right, and then I'm just going to scrape down the sides of my bowl again. All right. All right, and then I'm gonna add some more flour, and I'm gonna let this kind of mix together. So bring this down, add some flour, right, and then let it go. Now, this dough is supposed to be nice and kind of what we call soft dough, right? So we want to, the recipe called for 4.5 cups of flour. However, it depends on kind of the environment that you're in, right? So if you're in a very kind of dry area, you're probably going to need less flour, right? If you're in a very damp and wet area, you're probably going to need a little more flour, right? So today, on the day that I'm making it, which it's very damp outside, kind of wet, it was raining all day, and so I probably am not going to need as much flour as if I were kind of in the, or I'm probably going to need more flour, sorry, opposed to if I was kind of in the desert, or if it was like, a very hot day in the middle of the summer. Right, so when you go to make this, all right, this dough is going to be nice and soft, all right. So when you go to bring it together and you start to knead it, it may be a little kind of sticky on your hands, so you need to just be careful with that. But you don't want to add too much flour that you make it really stiff. All right, so there's a fine line between kind of making sure that it stays nice and soft, but also not getting it, all over your hands. All right, so I'm going to continue to mix this, and I will return back with you when this has all been put together, and then I'll talk a little bit about kneading. Okay, so let's get back to talking about how to do this by hand, right? So I previously just showed you how to do it if you were using a mixer. However, I know that not everybody has a mixer, so you might need to do this by hand, which is fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to get my station here prepared, right? So I'm going to just get a little flour, right? I'm going to just put some down on the counter. Right, and I'm just going to have a little extra just in case I need any for my hands. Right. Like I said, this dough is going to be kind of sticky, right? So please be careful when you do this. Definitely flour your hands, but the key about this is kind of making sure that you don't add too much flour because you don't want it to be a stiff dough. You want it to be a nice soft dough. Okay. So, all right, as I take this out. Okay, move this stand out of my way. All right, I'm gonna just kind of push the flour around. But what I actually like to do is just kind of leave a pile on one side so that I do have some I can work with as I need it. All right, and then I'm gonna use my rubber scraper. And scrape this out. Now, if you mix this all by hand, you obviously would be using a rubber scraper anyway. But okay, This should hopefully come out. Carefully. There we go. All right, and what you really want to do is you want to knead this for, the recipe says a minimum of 5 minutes. You want to really make sure that you're developing that gluten, if you remember me talking about the flour and the water, and then, or in this case, it's actually going to be the milk. All right, so I'm going to scoop this up. And like I said, because it's a little sticky, I want to make sure that I add a little flour to my hands here, right? And then I'm just going to knead it, right? Right. So being careful not to add too much flour, but at the same time, making sure it doesn't stick too much to my hands. All right, so kneading it by hand. Right, you take your flour, you can see how nice and soft and pliable it is. You want to push down, right, and I kind of fold it and push down. Fold, push, and you see I am rotating it. So this is the basics of kneading, right? If you're doing this by hand, you'll knead it for quite some time, about 5 minutes. If you're going to do it in the mixer, just let it mix with the the dough hook for about 5 minutes. But normally when I'm done with the dough hook, I will take it out just to kind of knead it by hand a little, just so I can kind of feel the bread and get a sense of how it is. Right, so because I kneaded this already in the machine, I don't really need to knead it a ton with my hands. But like I said, I just like to kind of feel the bread and see the texture. Right? You can see it's still a little sticky, and that's okay. But it's nice and soft, nice and kind of flexible, or what we call pliable. All right, so once we think that we've kind of kneaded this pretty good, right, you can actually put it into a bowl. Okay, make sure that bowl is nice and clean, right, and you actually want to put some saran wrap. Just cleaning this off. Some cooking spray. So I use canola oil, vegetable oil, whatever works for you. All right, so that it doesn't stick. All right, so what I'll do is I will just spray the inside of this clean bowl. Okay, and then I'm going to take this, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to put it in, and I'm actually going to turn it over so that I oil both sides. I do this so that as it rises, it rises into my saran wrap, it does not get it does not stick to the saran wrap. I apologize, I just want to wash my hands here. You're going to just cover this loosely with some saran wrap, and then you're going to let it rise for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. All right? Dough like this should double in size. Okay, so as long as it doubles in size, you're good to go. So I'm going to just take my saran wrap, put this over, oops, and then just cover this. And you'll notice that the saran wrap will actually there we go. The saran wrap will expand, right? Because it's going to have all that carbon dioxide in there, right? So we will come back in about 2 hours to see how it looks after it has doubled. Hi, actually we're going to talk real quick about cleaning up while you're waiting for your dough to rise. If you were kneading on the counter, and we did talk about this briefly in when we made scones, but I just wanted to talk real quick about it here again. So you can't really tell, unfortunately, on my counter because it is white, and obviously flour is white as well. But you'll notice when you're doing it that your counter tends to get a little stuck with flour. So you want to make sure that you clean off the flour first before you add any liquid, right? So I use my bench knife. Sometimes I can also use, I have just like a little this I can also use to scrape. But either way, whether you have a utensil that you can use or not, be sure to scrape off all the dry bits from your counter first before you wipe it down. All right. Once you add that water, it tends to get kind of stuck to the counter. So you want to make sure that you get all that flour up as much as possible before adding any water. Okay, so that was just a quick tip. All right, see you when we have dough risen to make the English muffins. All right, we are back to finish up our English muffins. Here is the dough. Whoa, it has really popped. Like I said, it should be doubling in size, right? So what we need to do is we need to, what they say, punch down, right? So punching down makes it sound a little violent. We're not really going to punch our dough, but what you're essentially doing is going to be deflating it, right? And releasing all that carbon dioxide. When you take the saran wrap off, you might be able to smell kind of that alcohol, like yeasty smell from that one byproduct of alcohol. And then that other byproduct is that carbon dioxide, right? So what you want to do is you just want to lightly kind of just deflate it, right? Pull it away from the sides here, okay? And so now I've just kind of deflated it a little, allowing it to release the carbon dioxide gas, right? So what I am actually going to do is I'm going to just put it down on the counter so that I can, let's see if we can just do it like this. All right, so I'm going to divide this dough into 16 pieces, right? So to do 16 pieces, right, actually I am going to put a little flour down. It is sticking a little too much for my liking. All right, so just place a little flour. All right, there we go. All right. All right, so 16 pieces. So that means that if I take this dough and I cut it in half, right, you could use a scale if you have it, if you really want to kind of be more exact, but, you know, this is home cooking. If I were doing this commercially, then yes, I would. However, I'm not. I'm just doing this for funsies at home, so I'm going to just cut these as evenly as possible. Right? I'm using a bench knife. You could use a butter knife, whatever works best for you. All right, so I have 4 pieces now. I'm going to cut these 4 pieces into halves again, which is going to give me 8 pieces. This is a perfect example of using fractions in real life. A lot of you always ask when you're ever going to use math in real life. Here's a perfect example. Right, and now I have 8, which means now I need to cut these in half again to get my 16. Right, so all right. So perfect. They don't have to be exactly perfect, but a good, close enough. All right, so now what I have to do is actually have to roll these into dough balls, okay? Now, the one thing about English muffins is that they are actually not baked. Instead, they are fried, okay? Or I shouldn't say fried. They're cooked on a griddle or a frying pan, a skillet, whatever it is you want to use, right? And so the way this works is that you have to actually let these rise one more time. So I'm just putting these all into nice little balls, dough balls here. And then I'm going to actually let them rise one more time. And actually, if you have a griddle, it works best just to put them all on if you can get as many on there and let them rise so that you can just turn your griddle on and then you can start cooking them. So you don't actually bake these, which is always kind of a little different than what most people are used to when making yeast breads, right? So like I said, I'm just rolling these all out, and then I will turn it over and show you the griddle. Right. Now, some of the recipes will tell you that you can use semolina flour or like cornmeal or whatever, and that's entirely up to you. I don't actually use it just because it's just an extra step that I don't feel is necessary. I think that they come out just fine without it. But if that's something you want to try, you are more than welcome to. It just gives that kind of, if you kind of ever had a English muffin like Thomas's English Muffins or whatever, it has kind of that like grainy feeling on the bottom of your English muffins. That's that semolina flour or cornmeal. All right, so rolling these all into balls. Right, and then I actually have like a fairly large griddle, so I actually think I might be able to fit most of these onto my griddle at once, which will be fantastic because then I can cook them all at once. Um, but all right, so as I roll these all in, and then I'm going to kind of scooch my way over. Right, like I think I've shown you this before in previous um, demonstrations, but here is my griddle. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to actually take my take these, okay, and then excuse me. All right, so just place them directly on here. If you don't have a big, large griddle like that, that is perfectly fine. Just use a cookie sheet or something, and you can place them on there. And then you're actually just going to cover it for about 20 minutes and let them rise one more time, and that way they don't dry out. All right. It does tell you if you can to kind of just flatten them. So, once you get them onto either your pan or your griddle, you can just flatten them out a little. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cover this and just let them sit here for another 20 minutes, right? I might have heard me say that there was a, there's a second rise. So we let the dough rise, right? And now we go ahead and shape our dough, right? And then we go ahead and let them rise again before we cook them. Okay, so get all of these on here. All right, like I said, this dough is going to be nice and soft and pliable. Okay. All right, so all 16 are on here. What I'm going to do is just kind of flatten these out. You want those kind of English muffins to be nice and flat. Right. You know that they're kind of homemade when they're not all exactly the same, right? And they're not all exactly rounded. They might be slightly misshapen, right? That kind of shows that kind of homemade look of an English muffin. Okay. All right. So I'm going to cover this, right, and let this kind of just sit for 20 minutes and proof one more time or rise. Okay, and again, I'm just letting it kind of be loose on here. It doesn't need to be super tight, just so that they don't dry out on me, right? Because they're nice and kind of moist right now, so don't want them too dry. All right. And so I will see you in about 20 minutes to bake these off, or to cook them off, I should say. All right, and then we can eat them. Welcome back. We are going to cook off these English muffins, and then we will be able to eat them. All right, so you can see that they have risen, not huge amounts, but a little. They should puff up a little. They're definitely not going to double in size the way the dough did originally, but they should get slightly larger. All right, so what I need to do is I'm just going to cook these on low for 7 to 10 minutes. Ideally, you want the interior of this to be about 200 degrees. If you don't have a thermometer, that's perfectly fine. But generally, we want it to be a nice kind of golden brown on the bottom. One of the issues, though, is that if you cook it too quickly, it'll cook the outside first versus the inside. If that happens, you can also put these into the oven at 375 and bake them for another about 10 minutes or so to get them to cook all the way through. So, like I said, if you have the griddle, that'd be awesome. I'm going to put this at my griddle at about 300 or so, 250, 300. If you're going to do it on the stove in a frying pan, you can do it kind of like low to medium low, so somewhere probably around 3, 4, maybe 5. That might be a little too hot. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let these kind of slowly cook, and then I will flip it over. So I will see you in about 5 minutes so that I can flip them over, and then I'll show you how to kind of open them up with a fork. Okay, so you can see the English muffins have started to cook. I'm going to look onto the bottom of this, and it looks nice and brown, so I'm going to flip these over and separate them. If they get a little stuck, that's perfectly fine. Just flip them all over so that they can cook on the other side. All right. I had started it at about 250, 300. I think that might have been a little too high, so I actually turned it down to about 200 because, like I said, I want to make sure that the insides are fully cooked as well. So just flip these all over just like they were pancakes. Nice dark brown, golden brown color. There we go. And then I'm going to just let those continue to cook on the other side until the other side is nice and golden brown as well. All right. Alright, so I'll be back to show you what they look like as the final product and show you how to actually split an English muffin. Alright, so these English muffins look like they're done on both sides, right? Brown on both sides. You can kind of flip them over again just to check. These did bake a little, or cook a little faster than I thought they would. They browned a lot faster, so I probably will put them into the oven for about, at 350 for about 10 minutes because I want to make sure that the insides are kind of finished and not super gooey on the inside. So the way we can figure that out is you can, if you, like I said, have a thermometer, you can ensure the inside is 200 degrees. However, it's not so common to have a thermometer. So if that is the case, we can just kind of cut into it and you can kind of see what it looks like from the inside. Oops. Just want to flip these all over to see the other side of this. And I'm going to take this little guy and see, because if the little one is definitely not done, then obviously the bigger ones are not going to be done either. So when you do this, please be careful because they will be hot. But generally speaking, when you split an English muffin, you don't actually use it with a knife, you do it with a fork. Because the whole purpose of those English muffins is to have those nooks and crannies. So that like when you put butter in it, it kind of melts into all those little nooks and crannies of your English muffin. So what you can do is instead you take a fork. Okay, so you take this English muffin and you cut it around with your fork like so, and it will split apart. And you should hopefully have. These are definitely. Hopefully, it shouldn't be flat across when you cut into it. It should be nice and kind of uneven when you cut into it. You should let these cool all the way down. However, I just wanted to cut into it so you could see. But you can see how there's all these little nooks and crannies. That's what makes it kind of that traditional English muffin. But yeah, these are definitely not cooked all the way through, so I will be baking them for a little longer to ensure that they're cooked through. All right, so that is English muffins, and I hope that you enjoy, and I will see you next time. Thanks.